Her name was Admiral Elena Hart. At 45, she had once been the youngest strategic officer in the Pacific Fleet, a woman with the mind of a war map and a presence that commanded without ever raising her voice. She didn't need volume, just clarity, just precision. Commanders twice her age deferred to her instincts, and cadets studied her battle simulations like sacred texts. But 12 years ago, during a covert maritime operation near the Kuriil Islands, something went wrong. A civilian freighter was damaged. 3 Navy officers were lost. The mission had been classified details buried beneath layers of protocol. But the fallout, that part was very public. A single press release painted the operation as a failure of leadership. No names were mentioned, but inside Navy circles, everyone knew whose hand had drawn the mission map, Elena Hart's. She wasn't given a hearing. There was no tribunal, no defense. Her resignation was requested, her rank quietly removed from records. No formal dismissal, just a silence that swallowed her entire career. And her family. They didn't fight for her. They didn't even ask. The Harts were a Navy lineage, her father, Rear Admiral Lawrence Hart, a legend in the Atlantic Command. Her older brother James had followed his footsteps. When Elena disappeared, James stepped into the very command she had once trained for. No one questioned it. No one mentioned her again. At family dinners, she became a ghost in plain sight. Elena. She used to serve. No one asked what happened that night near the Kuriils. No one wondered what it felt like to be blamed without a voice. And Elena never explained. She walked away. Not with shame, but with the silence of someone who had seen too much and said too little for too long. They erased her name from the records, but they couldn't erase it from the sea. After the Navy erased her, Elena didn't fight back. She just left. No press conference, no lawsuit, no bitter final word. She packed a small bag, drove north, and kept driving until the world stopped asking where she'd gone. She ended up in coastal Maine, where the shoreline was jagged and honest, and the people knew how to leave each other alone. She found a room for rent above an old lighthouse station, the kind that still needed manual calibration in storm season, and took it without asking too many questions. The landlady was a widow who liked silence, which made her and Elena a perfect match. In that town, no one cared what her last name was, so she changed it. From Hart to Hale, close enough to sound real distant enough to keep the past buried. Elena Hale, a woman who taught part-time at the local community college and fixed radios on the side. Twice a week, she helped train cadets from the nearby Coast Guard unit. Not in combat, not in strategy, just the basics. Navigation, current drift patterns, what to do when systems failed and instincts had to take over. The young recruits never asked what she used to do. They just knew she was good. Not loud, not flashy, but good. Like the kind of good that comes from surviving something that should have broken you. She never posted online. No social media, no photos, just weather alerts and maritime briefings. Every morning she still read the sea reports like she had clearance even though she didn't. She kept her old watch still set to naval time, still used short-clipped speech when she gave instructions, still ironed her jackets with the care of someone who used to wear a uniform that carried weight. But no one saluted her now. Sometimes former cadets from the academy would email asking if she was okay. She never replied. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know what to say. How do you explain becoming a ghost? Not dying, just fading quietly into the fog. Her family didn't visit, didn't ask. Birthdays passed without cards. Even the Navy stopped sending notices after the 5th year. At first, she thought the silence would hurt, but in time, it became a kind of armor. A uniform made not of fabric, but of stillness. Of choosing not to answer questions no one asked with Hart. She would rise early, often before the tide. Brew strong black coffee in the tiny kitchen she shared with the scent of old rope and sea salt. Then she'd walk the beach in boots she once wore across steel decks. She would trace patterns in the sand with her heel, a mind still working through logistics and routes long after the orders had stopped coming. Sometimes she'd stand at the edge of the cliffs and close her eyes, pretending she could still hear the command deck radios, buzzing voices calling for coordinates. It was muscle memory. And memory she learned doesn't always ask for permission to stay. A few locals grew fond of her. The dock manager, a Vietnam vet named Hal, would sometimes invite her for coffee, never pushing for answers. Just two ghosts, trading in silence. The college dean asked once why she didn't want a full-time post. She replied simply, "I'm just here to keep the compass steady for a while." He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. Years passed. She didn't date, didn't decorate, didn't pretend. Her walls held no awards, no portraits, just maps. Old sea charts. Battle plans that no one else remembered. She kept her medals in a shoebox under her bed, not out of shame, but because they no longer felt like hers. What few people knew was that Elena still ran drills, alone. She would take the dinghy out in the early morning fog and run tactical maneuvers marking imaginary enemy zones, tracking phantom vessels in her head. Not because she had to, but because part of her still believed the mission wasn't over. She told herself she didn't miss it, that the Navy had taken the best parts of her and used them until they burned out. But sometimes when the lighthouse beam swept over the sea and the fog broke just enough for stars to appear, she would wonder if anyone remembered. Not the headlines, not the rumors, but her. The way she used to sit alone in the war room building routes through chaos. The way she carried responsibility like a weight that belonged to her and her alone. The way she listened before giving orders and still carried the names of the officers lost that night, like prayers folded in her chest. She wasn't bitter, she was just outside of time, a sailor with no ship, a commander with no war, a name no longer whispered even in the corridors she once walked. But even ghosts leave footprints, and every morning the waves erased hers, and still every morning she came back to make them again. Because the rhythm stayed. Because she hadn't vanished. She had simply gone quiet. It arrived on a windy Tuesday afternoon. A thick embossed envelope slid beneath her weathered cottage door. No knock, no footsteps. Just a silent delivery carried by salt wind and faded memory. Elena stared at it for a moment before reaching down. The seal was unmistakable, gold-pressed with the insignia of the United States Navy. Her breath caught in her throat. It had been years since anything official had come her way. She used to receive updates, formal notices, even academy invites until she disappeared, until she chose silence. But this was something else. Inside was a single card, crisp and weighty. USS Lexington, Ceremony of Command. Incoming Strategist Commander Nathan Cole. No greeting, no handwritten note. Not even a return address. And yet she recognized the name instantly. Nathan Cole. Once a junior officer, wide-eyed, quietly brilliant. He had served under her briefly back when she still held rank. Back when she still walked across the steel decks of the Halcyon with the weight of the Pacific in her chest. Cole had been one of the few who didn't just follow orders. He studied them, asked questions, stayed late in briefing rooms to learn why, not just what. She remembered him once asking, "How do you make decisions under fire?" And she had told him, "You prepare so thoroughly it's not fire, just fog." Now he was rising, and somehow through some unseen thread of memory, her name had made it into this invitation, whether by his hand or someone else's. She couldn't be sure. It wasn't addressed to her, but still she went. She didn't pack a uniform, not even the civilian equivalent. Instead, she laid out a steel gray blouse, tailored slacks, and the same boots she used to polish before inspections, though now she polished them for no one but herself. She told no one she was leaving. No farewell to her neighbor, no note on the door. Just a packed overnight bag, a soft sigh, and the first train out of town. The naval base was larger than she remembered, brighter, louder, but still full of that same sterile formality where even smiles were rehearsed and boots struck pavement like time signatures. She passed through the security gates without trouble. Her name wasn't on any list, but she had learned long ago how to walk like she belonged. No one stopped her. She arrived early and chose a place in the very back of the command hall, near the exit, close to the shadows. The room filled slowly with brass and ribbons, family members in pressed suits, photographers ready to immortalize the legacy. No one noticed the woman standing still in gray. until Nathan Cole stepped onto the stage. He was older now, sharper, but she could still see the officer he'd once been. His voice was steady as he thanked the fleet, the mentors, and the training officers. Then mid-sentence he paused. Elena saw it, that slight flicker in his gaze, like a current changing direction. His eyes scanned the room once more and landed on her. For a moment his expression stilled. His fingers curled tighter around the podium. Then he spoke, not from the notes in front of him, but from memory. "There was once a strategist," he began, "who taught me that silence isn't absence, it's discipline. That knowing when not to speak is the mark of a leader, not the lack of one." A few heads turned. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her clarity was louder than commands. Her decisions saved lives. And her name disappeared far too soon from the halls of this fleet. He took a breath. "If she's here today, I want her to know the principles she taught never left us. She didn't just lead, she shaped." Whispers swelled through the room. Some turned, some stood, some searched the rows. And finally the commander standing beside Cole, a man in full dress, silver-streaked stoic, stepped forward. He looked directly at the back of the room where Elena stood. No badge, no title, just presence. He raised his hand in a formal salute. "Admiral," he said, voice calm and deliberate, "we await your orders." The room fell silent, not the kind of silence made from shock. The kind made from memory returns to its rightful place. Elena didn't move for a long moment. Her heart did, not out of triumph, but out of quiet vindication. Because what she had built didn't vanish. It lived on in those who remembered. It echoed in minds that still carried her teachings. It rose in rooms she was never meant to return to. She didn't need a nameplate. She didn't need to walk the stage. She had already arrived. The night before the ceremony, the coast was silent. Moonlight low and the sky heavy with salt air. Elena had returned to her small rented room just outside the base. She hadn't planned to stay, but something told her the night wasn't done with her. That's when the message came. It arrived not through official channels, not by knock or whisper, but through a nearly forgotten inbox tied to her Navy ID. An encrypted email. No sender, no subject, just a time-stamped signature and one attachment. She opened it carefully, letting her instincts guide her. No malware, no traceable metadata. What she found stopped her breath. A draft of a news exposé. Headline bolded, already formatted for distribution scandal. Beneath the surface. Rising naval star accused of intellectual theft. Beneath that, Nathan Cole's name. A detailed accusation. It claimed he had submitted fleet strategies, high-level classified ones, as part of his promotion materials, and that the work wasn't his. The article went further, citing anonymous sources, internal memos, and strategy diagrams. She recognized the diagrams instantly, not because they were public, but because she had drawn them. Hand-sketched, annotated in margins, with shorthand only 3 people on Earth could have interpreted her former aide, and one senior analyst who had died in a Black Sea mission. Her chest tightened. These weren't just strategy blueprints. They were battle logic. Memory. Lessons were written long before anyone had paid attention. And yet here they were, resurfaced, manipulated, and aimed like a weapon. But at whom the article suggested Cole had stolen them. Passed them off as his own, that his rise to command was built on shadows. But Elena knew Nathan. She had trained him. She remembered the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he lingered after debriefings, not to flatter but to learn. No, he wouldn't have done this. Still there, they were her old words, her methods, her unacknowledged legacy, resurfacing not to honor her, but to bury him. Within an hour she received a summons, a private meeting. Not in uniform, not in public. A quiet, sterile conference room at the base hosted by 3 officers from the Ethics Oversight Committee. No press, no flags, just forms, legal pads, and the kind of stillness that usually comes before judgment. They greeted her as Ms. Hart. No rank, no title, as if those years didn't count anymore. "We've been asked to confirm authorship," one said, sliding the documents toward her. "These were discovered in Commander Cole's training submissions." "Do you recognize them?" Elena studied the pages. Every detail, the notations, the arrows, even the misspelled word in the lower corner, they were hers. Undoubtedly. But they weren't recent. They were from the time before she fell. From the vault of ideas she'd once carried in her head, scribbled in ink, because the fleet had no time for slow minds. The silence hung in the room. "We're asking as a matter of integrity," the second officer said. "If these were originally yours, the committee will launch an investigation into intellectual misconduct." Elena remained quiet. Not out of fear, but because of her silence, she once again had power. She looked at them calmly. The truth sat right there in front of her in her hands in the folds of time. She could speak. One sentence and Cole's name would spiral into disgrace. One sentence and maybe hers would finally be cleared. But she didn't speak. Because she saw the trap, saw the blade hidden beneath the invitation. This wasn't about justice. This was about leverage. Someone had unearthed her forgotten brilliance not to restore her, but to destroy him. To weaponize what was left of her name and aim it at someone she had once called promising. It wasn't revenge, it was manipulation. So she set the papers down. "I have no comment," she said softly. The officers looked at each other. "You're saying you won't confirm or deny?" "I'm saying," she replied, "that if your investigation depends on erasing a man's integrity using something you ignored for a decade, then maybe the problem isn't whose ideas they were." They didn't press further. They dismissed her politely. As she stood, one of them said, "You could take credit, you know. We can fix the record." She looked over her shoulder. "I didn't come back for the record." That night back in her room, she stared out at the water. She thought of how the waves never asked for credit, how they carved the cliffs anyway. She thought of how power didn't always come from being heard. Sometimes it came from choosing when not to speak. The ocean had never looked so still. The deck of the USS Lexington shimmered under the weight of midday sun. White hats, sharp salutes, glinting metals. The ship stood firm in the middle of the Pacific, its presence a monument to discipline and rank. Every detail from the wind-flared flags to the tightly choreographed seating pulsed with ritual, order, hierarchy. Among the assembled officers and guests, one figure didn't quite belong. She stood in the back row, unlisted, unannounced, unaccompanied. Elena Hart. No bars on her shoulder. No name stitched across her chest. Just a navy blue coat from another era, a low bun at her nape, and an expression like the horizon, vast, unreadable still. If anyone recognized her, they didn't show it. She stood alone, but not unseen. Commander Nathan Cole stood at the podium delivering his address. His voice was measured, trained. He spoke of duty, of legacy, of leadership earned. And then came the final section, the acknowledgments. He began naming those who shaped his path: commanding officers, mentors, instructors. His words were steady, until he stopped. Mid-sentence. His gaze scanned the deck, swept across rows of white, paused, then landed. His breath caught. She was real, not a ghost, not a memory. There she stood, the woman who once shaped doctrines and ink-stained notebooks, the strategist whose silence had taught him more than orders ever could. Elena met his gaze. She did not flinch. It had been over a decade since they'd spoken. Over a decade since anyone in uniform had said her name without a wince or a whisper. But Nathan didn't hesitate. He stepped away from the microphone. The room fell quiet. The shift was visible, murmurs silenced a hush rolling across the deck like a tide pulling back. Then Nathan walked forward, through rows of brass past his own family, ignoring the press cameras angled toward the stage. And he stopped in front of her. He raised his hand and saluted. "Admiral Hart," he said, his voice shaking, but strong. "We await your orders." The words hit the deck with more force than a cannon. Not just a ceremony, not just deference. It was a reversal, a quiet revolution. For one impossible moment, the hierarchy bent in her direction, not out of protocol, but truth. There was no applause. Not yet. only stunned silence. A few rows up, her father, retired Admiral Lawrence Hart, sat stone still. The same man who once whispered to colleagues that his daughter never had the steel for long-term command. He lowered his gaze. He didn't stand. He didn't salute. But for the first time, he didn't speak over her shadow. There were no speeches from her, no dramatic music, just a slight nod. Elena's chin dipped once subtly. Not out of pride, but grace, the kind that arrives when you no longer need the room to cheer to know you've arrived. Nathan's salute remained in place for a heartbeat longer, then lowered with reverence. And in that pause where thunder might have been the fleet, remembered something it had forgotten, that brilliance doesn't always come with applause, that sometimes the greatest leaders are the ones you try to bury. And still they rose. Afterward, no one dared ask why she was there. There was no official record of her presence, no signature on the guest list, no press release. But every officer who stood on that deck would later remember a quiet woman in a Navy coat, a salute that defied history, and a name, Admiral Hart, returned to the wind. There was no announcement, no article, no headline, no viral video of the salute. But in the week following the USS Lexington ceremony, whispers began. High Command spoke quietly. Emails were exchanged with no subject lines. Someone had watched. Someone with influence. And then 3 days later, a black car pulled into the narrow gravel path outside Elena's small home on the coast of Maine. A young officer stepped out carrying a sealed envelope with gold trim. No rank on his collar, no questions in his tone. He simply saluted, handed her the envelope, and left. Inside the letter read, Admiral Hart. The Fleet Strategic Council respectfully invites you to serve on the Strategic Maritime Intelligence Board, a new directive built on resilience, insight, and the wisdom of those history has once overlooked. Your voice is not only welcome, it is needed. No apology. But then Elena had stopped waiting for apologies a long time ago. She didn't reply with words, just showed up at the appointed time, at the appointed place, dressed in her deep blue coat, her boots polished, not for show, but because habit is the last thing to leave a soldier. She walked through the base's front gates past officers decades younger, all with questions in their eyes and reverence in their posture. The board had convened in a glass-paneled room overlooking the sea, a sea she never stopped reading, never stopped respecting. The Admiral chair sat empty until she filled it. No one asked why she was gone. They only asked what she thought now. And she gave them her thoughts clear and calm. Tactical brilliance that once filled the margins of forgotten reports now rose through her voice, delivered with the poise of someone who no longer needed to be heard, but was. That evening there was a gala. It was formal, high-ranking, polished, the kind of event where everyone stood straighter when an admiral passed. Elena didn't wear her old stars. She wore a simple navy dress with silver buttons, and her hair was half-pinned in quiet waves. She stood at the edge of the room, hands folded, watching as the younger generation toasted to things she had once written in the dark. Strategies, principles, values, without knowing who birthed them. And then, a moment. A young officer no older than 26 approached her slowly, a glass of water in hand, not wine. His tie slightly askew, his eyes wide and honest. "Ma'am," he said, "I found your old tactical journals. One of my instructors gave them to me last year, said we weren't supposed to officially study from them, that they were too dated." He paused, then added, "But they weren't outdated. They were ahead of their time." Elena tilted her head. The boy continued, "Some of the notations, I've never seen logic flow like that, like a map folding itself into formation." She didn't answer right away, just gave him a long look, the kind that sees past age and rank and uniform. Then she nodded once and walked past him toward the outer deck. A small group had gathered near the command hall's brass wall, the one reserved for distinguished service recognitions. It had been remodeled since her time. New names, new tiles, but the air around it still held something sacred. As Elena stepped forward, the crowd parted gently. There, etched into the polished metal, right beneath a plaque titled Thought Leaders in Modern Naval Doctrine, were the words, Admiral Elena Hart, Commander of Thought, Defender of Silence. 12 years ago, they erased her from the books. Now they'd carved her into the walls, not for heroics, not for redemption, but for endurance, precision, the quiet fire of someone who didn't need to shout to prove she had led. A few officers behind her saluted in silence. She didn't turn. She simply stood for a moment longer, letting the sea breeze move through the back of her coat, feeling for the first time in years like she hadn't been forgotten. She hadn't risen despite the silence. She had risen through it. The sky over coastal Maine was soft gray when Elena stepped off the plane. No one was waiting for her. She didn't expect anyone. The shuttle dropped her at the edge of the pier, the same stretch of road she had walked for the past decade. Her boots pressed into gravel with the familiar weight of silence. She didn't need an escort or a salute or a crowd. She had walked battlefields lonelier than this. The lighthouse stood just as she'd left it, tall, weathered, unbothered by history. The world had changed. But this little corner of it hadn't. A gull cried above as she unlocked the faded blue door. The hinges squeaked like old friends. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of salt and wood and thyme. Her coat slid from her shoulders and onto its hook by instinct. Her hand found the light switch without looking. Everything was still there. The modest table, the chipped mug. The faded nautical maps were rolled and tied with old twine. The small stove where she brewed her morning tea. And the drawer. She walked to it without ceremony. Opened it. Inside were her handwritten mission plans from years past, some on Navy parchment, others sketched on the backs of napkins, receipts, whatever paper she had at the time. Next to them were letters, some opened, some never sent. A medal that hadn't been returned. A photo of her brother as a boy saluting her with a toy ship in his hand. And beneath it all, the note. A single sheet folded 3 times, edges softened by time. She knew what it said. She didn't need to read it, but she did anyway. If anyone remembers me, I hope it's not for how I disappeared, but for how I stayed quiet when noise would have been easier. There were no tears, no cinematic swell of grief or joy, only a small breath, the kind that feels like an exhale after years of holding it in. She refolded the note, placed it back, closed the drawer gently, like tucking in something sacred. Not hiding it, but letting it rest. Then she walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle. Her movements were calm, practiced. The gas flame flickered to life. The water began to warm. Outside, the sea whispered against the rocks. A rhythm she'd come to rely on, steady, disinterested, honest. She poured the tea, held the cup close, and stepped onto the small balcony that overlooked the shoreline. A storm was coming. She could smell it in the air. But she wasn't afraid. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel forgotten. She didn't feel erased. She had chosen silence not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew the world would one day remember without her shouting. And now it had. She didn't need the last word. She had the truth, and the ocean, and peace. It was the kind of morning where the sky held its breath, all soft light and suspended time. Admiral Elena Hart sat in the back seat of a black government sedan as it passed through the outer gates of the Mid-Atlantic Naval Academy. Her name hadn't been on the official schedule. She wasn't here to speak or to be honored or even to be introduced. She was here to observe. A quiet invitation had come from a junior officer, a former student of a student. A ripple from a ripple. That was how legacies moved. The campus had changed since she last walked the grounds like this. New buildings, updated simulators, fresh cadets in pressed uniforms, shoulders too tight, eyes too eager. But the soul of it was the same. She slipped into a large lecture hall midway through a lesson on fleet maneuvers and logistical ethics. A young professor, passionate but rushed, scribbled across a digital board. His words chased his thoughts. Elena stayed in the last row. No nameplate, no attention drawn. She watched, The cadets didn't recognize her. Not really. But 2 rows ahead, a young woman nudged her friend and whispered, "That's Admiral Hart. They say she vanished. No one knows why." Her friend shrugged. "Guess she wasn't built for the pressure," he muttered. Elena didn't flinch. She wasn't offended. They didn't know better, not yet. And maybe they didn't need to. The lecture ended. Cadets filed out in a rush of movement and noise, some flipping open energy bars, others calling home. Elena waited for the room to empty. Then she stood. At the front of the room, she picked up a white stick of chalk, something almost nostalgic in its simplicity, and wrote a single line across the bottom of the board. Her handwriting was firm, clean, unmistakable. Strength doesn't need volume, just presence. She capped the chalk, set it down, and walked out. No announcement, no applause, no photographs, just the sound of her footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. Outside, the air carried salt from the nearby harbor. Seagulls circled overhead, and the wind pulled gently at the hem of her coat. She paused for a moment on the stone path leading back to the car. A cadet passed her unaware, and nodded politely. She returned the gesture. The driver opened the door, but she didn't step in immediately. She turned instead, looking back toward the academy, watching the flags flutter, the walls that would someday house memories not yet written. And somewhere in there, among papers and protocols and late-night debates, a student would read that line. Maybe not today. Maybe not even this year. But eventually. And maybe, just maybe, they'd understand that the most powerful leaders don't always lead with a microphone. They lead with presence, with steadiness, with knowing who they are even when the world forgets. She stepped into the car. The door closed with a soft click. As the vehicle pulled away, she leaned her head against the window eyes, following the curve of the coastline, the endless meeting of land and sea. No matter how many storms passed, the ocean always returned to the shore. That's what she had done. Not with rage, not with vengeance, but with clarity. The truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to stand. And Elena Hart had stood.